politics, business, sports, arts, music. Mike and Marty on the feed. Mike and Marty. Mike and Marty.
Good morning, Rockingham and Bellows Falls. It's Mike and Marty on the feed. Here we are. It's September 15th.
We're flying through September.
Oh, man, I can't believe it. It's too fast. We're
is.
halfway through the
It
month, but we're shooting down the other side and coming up on fall. It seems like there's a lot of local events and a lot of local fall events coming up.
Yeah, and I saw some trees have started to change, and oh goodness. So just reminding everybody that it is Classic Wednesday, and at the Opera House this Wednesday is Double Indemnity. It is sponsored by the Greater Falls Insurance. Next Wednesday, there will not be a classic movie night. It'll actually be a live event. I think the first live event in the theater in quite some time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is an evening with David Sedaris. I'm guessing tickets are still available. I don't think it's sold out yet, so tickets are still available. You would go to the Opera House website. And then the following Wednesday night is a free classic movie night. It's sponsored by the Bellows Falls Rotary Club, and it's Easy Rider.
A classic
boomer
movie.
A classic boomer movie. And
That's
if people are looking to support BIFTA, the Downtown Development Alliance, they are selling T-shirts, and they also have coffee tumblers with a really cool Bellows Falls logo on it that they've designed. So go to the site. The T-shirts, I think, are $20. I'm not sure the cost of the coffee mugs. I didn't look. But you can get the T-shirts in a variety of colors, and you can wear them proudly. It's a little heart and going up to the state of Vermont, and it says Bellows Falls. And the heart is actually the
heart
bee.
Is the bee. That's
Yeah,
really
which is pretty
cute.
cool.
Yeah, very nice. And then also in Chester this weekend, there's going to be the Fall Festival on the Green.
Okay.
And then in Brattleboro is Bacon Fest. Who wouldn't go to Bacon
Go to
Fest?
Bacon
huh?
Fest.
And then we have to remind people that next month we're going to be doing the Flannel Festival out at the farm out in Rockingham
Hill Farm. Yep.
Yeah, so remember that. And then next Thursday, a project Marty and I are working on is a documentary film called to Duty. We'll be premiering at the Opera House at 7:30 for donations. There's going to be fire trucks and firemen, and so it's going to be a real event. So I hope you'll come out and support our local fire department.
And all the money raised will be going to the Firefighter Memorial Park.
Right, exactly. But today we have an interesting guest. We have Gail Golec, who does a podcast called The Secret Life of Death. Ominous.
It is.
But welcome, Gail. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, because I know you're an archaeologist, and I can understand where that might lead to where you're going right now, the path you've taken. But tell us a little bit. Where are you from? How did you study? And then how did you move to doing podcasts?
Well, I'm a local gal. I grew up in Alstead, and for the past 20 years or so have been a professional archaeologist working in Vermont, New Hampshire primarily. And so I've gotten to travel all over the state, both of these states, doing work and getting to know local histories as I go along.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my side interests beyond archaeology has always been historic cemeteries. And so while doing research for different projects over the years, you sift through all these old town histories, and you start to find these interesting stories and little weird things that crop up in every little town, and you can sort of connect all of those things through cemeteries because everybody, taxes and death, everybody has to experience all of those things. So that seemed to be an interesting way to tell some of those stories that I was coming across. And there's just so much about cemeteries that I find very interesting, and they're unique into themselves, but then they also share a lot of characteristics in different regions. And so as a historian and an anthropologist, you can study the cemeteries and different aspects of them, and they can give you insights into the local communities throughout different periods of time. So that's and I thought that would be a really interesting way to start telling stories. And podcasts are a great way to do that as well. It's an audio format as opposed to having sort of like a radio show for people who aren't familiar with what podcasts are. But you listen to it on your computer, or if you have a smartphone, you can listen to them that way, and they can be all sorts of different formats for the podcast. And this one, I go out to the sites of these different cemeteries. I'm kind of taking people along with me as I'm exploring and discovering things, and then weaving in a narrative of the background research that I've done to sort of tie it all together.
Yeah, it sounds it. And on your website, I thought it was interesting that you look for the why, the how, the who, and the WTF.
Yeah. There's a lot of WTF. Just like,
I imagine.
What? Really? How did that happen? A lot of bizarre, weird things that just have sort of either fallen out of favor or just aren't fashionable anymore, or that used to be very commonplace. And some of that stuff, looking back 200 years later, is sort of like, whoa. What? and those are those weird things. They're so much fun to find out.
Yeah. And you started, so your first episode planned, like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Your first episode is the epidemic spotted fever in Ackworth. Did that happen pre-pandemic, during the pandemic? Did you search it out specifically, or you just found a grave that intrigued you? Was it all just happenstance?
I did that one in 2016. So
wow.
That was a while, started working on it then, and so this was way before any of this stuff happened. And so there's, I guess, the lesson in that is that, yeah, history repeats itself, doesn't it? And it was totally by happenstance that I was out in Ackworth doing one of the things I find interesting. Go to cemeteries and you look around and just see what you find. And this gravestone popped up in the back of the cemetery, and I was looking at it and reading it, and it had this inscription on it talking about a particular person, Jane Greer, who, and the inscription underneath it said she was the first person to die of spotted fever in this town, and 53 people followed. And so that really piqued my interest. Like, this seemed to have been 53 people in 3 months died of this infectious disease. So that was it sort of wrote itself, really. I didn't have, and that's the thing with a lot of these, I don't make anything up, I don't embellish anything. This is all what really happened. And it's even, and that even gives you even more WTF. Like, this really happened. Wow.
Can you believe this?
Yeah, that's what I find so interesting. I was looking through your website, and so you have a cemetery adventures team.
Yeah.
And you literally just, in your free time, just whatever intrigues you, and then you start to. Have you ever found a gravesite that you couldn't find a good story to?
It's always, some of the stuff is pretty obvious when you go, like the one in Ackworth. It actually has it written on the gravestone, and some of it's, oh, this is an interesting name, or this is like the design of the gravestone. There's a whole field of study about the gravestone art and who the carvers were, and what artistic and social and religious influences came to bear on what they decided to carve and things like that. And so sometimes I just say, that's different, that's interesting. And then I go home and do a little research, and suddenly this whole story just sort of opens up in front of you, based around just something that seemed totally random that just caught my attention. And I've never been disappointed. Yeah, there's always something.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
It's looking, I've been to the meeting house, the Rockingham, and their graveyard is, I guess, one of the sites of a school of carving art, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's fascinating that the icons all meant certain things, and the way they're shaped and how they were put on the slate were just all, they were meaningful at the time, and had probably there's a lot of lost meaning now, but it's really a work of art. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. The Rockingham School, or the Wright, it was a family of stone carvers called the Wright family, and they're famous. They're world renowned for the particular style of carving that they had in their school and that they taught to other people who attended, who were apprentices. And so you see those themes in the apprentices' work in this area, and then as those people move to different places in Western New York and in other areas, you see those same design motifs show up in different places. And then sort of the fun part is to put that together. It's like, well, why is this? A lot of them in the Rockingham School are these little faces, and sort of like they call them soul effigies. So they're meant to represent the person in the grave, not like a literal portrait of them, but just this spirit, this entity. And
Really
you see that very prominent here in a lot of the graveyards around here. And then you start to see it pop up in different areas and say, oh, well, that was because they had an apprentice from the Wright School, and then they opened their own studio somewhere else, or they moved out west.
Wow, that's incredible, isn't it?
It is very, I found the whole topic really fascinating. We were actually traveling this weekend, and we were in Maine, and I don't remember where it was. I don't remember if it was off of the highway. And I thought of you because I knew we had this podcast coming up. There was the tiniest little graveyard. I mean, there was all of this development around it, but then this little tiny graveyard, probably like maybe 20 stones had been preserved. And I thought, ooh, I bet there's a story there.
Yeah, and isn't it funny when you start to see those things, and you see them everywhere, kind of one of those sorts of things, and you do start to think about, look at how the landscape has changed. Look at how the area where you are, that when you start to see a lot of development in these little tiny, usually when they're that small, they're usually family plots. And say, so that in itself starts to tell you a whole story, that there used to be a family here, or there used to be a village here. And one of the things that is fun for me too, if anybody else likes to drive around on the back roads in Vermont and New Hampshire, and you'll be out in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and you won't have seen a house for 1.5 miles, 2 miles, and then there's this little cemetery on the side of the road. And so you say, wow, well, and then you go back and look, there used to be a whole little village up and around here that isn't there anymore. And so that tells you a lot too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And it's so I was so when you talk about you tell their story, you literally don't, from what I gather from your site, you literally don't just tell the narrative, but you bring in some folks to actually have an interactive narrative to tell the story. Yes.
Right.
I've been lucky enough to have a lot of friends who enjoy this type of thing too. So I have my cemetery action team come along with me, because it's nice to get other people's reactions to some of these things too, and share that experience. And I think for listening to that makes a good audio experience for the listener too. And then I also have talked to professionals outside of my area expertise to get their input on. I've talked to Brian Post, who is he's a gravestone restorer. He's a stonemason, master mason, and one of his jobs, one of his skill sets is to go around to historic cemeteries, clean old stones that have been that are weathered and you can't read them, and then reassemble them in a safe way, so that they are preserved. And a friend of mine, Michelle Mogavero, who is a jewelry expert of all things. How does that tie in? But there was at the late 1700s into the 1800s, early 1900s, there was this whole industry of mourning jewelry that went along with the mourning of death and dying, that people would have pendants and have rings that were dedicated to the death of a beloved family member.
Oh, really?
And so then there's this whole crossover between what you see showing up on the jewelry, like the styles and the motifs that are the same as the gravestones.
Oh.
So there's a crossover there too.
Wow, that's fascinating.
I know.
Yeah.
We could. What are you working on currently? What is your episode currently?
The current episode, I was just talking to Mike before we started. I've been working on a very long project about the Andrews Inn, which isn't technically about gravestones, but it turned out to be such an interesting local history story that I kind of couldn't put it down, and really ran with it because this was something that happened in my lifetime that I honestly didn't know a whole lot about. And so I was just really interested to find out as much as I could and put together a story that for a lot of local people, and that was the thing, I would talk to, my parents knew about it, but nobody in my generation really knows anything about it.
That's
and
true.
Even in the LGBTQ plus community, not many people have ever heard of it. So I was like, boy, why is that? That's interesting. And
it was
leading
edge. I mean, it was on the frontier. It was it was so far ahead of its time.
It was. It really was. And that's a fascinating tidbit in and of itself. Like, wow, this thing happened right here. And I love that. I love that so much.
It's sort of an ironic that a place that would be ahead of its time could take place would happen in a village that doesn't want to move from 150 years ago,
And that's exactly it. That was, I think, sort of where I came down on it. Like, wow, how did this happen? But then in some ways it sort of makes sense because once you tease apart all of the details, oh, okay, yeah, I get it now.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm fascinated. I really want to listen to that episode because it was such a change in the, I think the attitude and the way the town evolved almost was.
So
Yeah.
where do you do your research? I guess is it online? Do you go to libraries? I mean, is it a combination of everything?
It's luckily with my training as an archaeologist and historian, I do a lot of it online, but then there's also a lot of other resources at local historical societies and traveling to on-site, going to the cemeteries themselves. A lot of it is just gathering data and making my own observations. And so luckily none of that really costs any money. It's just a lot of time. And it's something, especially during the pandemic, which was really beneficial for me because you could do a lot of that stuff from home, or you could do the interviews remotely. But prior to that, and hopefully soon, I'll be able to reestablish going out and talking to other people in person, and that's always the most fun because you never really know what you're going to find out from people and how the conversation is going to go, and it's sort of similar to the research into the gravestones. You'll find something out, and there's something good there, but you don't know what's going to pop up when you're doing the research or talking to somebody, or just how your conversation evolves, and these things create themselves as you're working together, and that's also a really fun part of the process for me.
So do you then script it? I mean, in order to create a narrative, do you have to script certain parts and do narration and then read that, or is it a combination of script and interview, and how's that work?
Yes, it's so the way that I put it together, whether it's right or wrong, I'm not sure, but so there's the live element of things that I've gone out into the field and recorded, and you do have to edit that down. You gather way more material than you'll ever use, and only use a few seconds of it. It seems like in some cases, and then yes, to tell the story part of it, to move it along and to help establish information, and to bring people along as you're moving from place to place or topic to topic. There's a script that comes into play where I'll do the voiceover narration, and that's sort of the information dump where you get a lot of the details and history and things like that. And I try to make it interesting. I'm not just, even though I'm reading the script, I'm trying not to make it sound like it's just a textbook. It's a little less formal than some things, and and then it's just you kind of cut back and forth to different places where I've done recording or different interviews, and then music and all of the editing things come into play to help you break the story up and cue the public into, okay, now we're going to change topic, music changes a little bit, or some outdoor sounds come in, so something is changing, so that just gives them a cue that we're changing gears here, and to listen a little bit differently.
It sounds as more complex than video editing. Because at least we have pictures, you can see the picture, you know what's going on. I mean, if you're painting the story in people's minds with words, so it's,
Well, I think there's probably benefits and pluses and minuses to both, and I think the words are generally where I am most comfortable, and so for me it just seems kind of like, oh yeah, that's a natural thing. But there's also there's the website. Each episode is available through the website, and also any of the major podcast outlets that are out there, any of the podcast platforms. And
well, that's a perfect segue, because we're almost out of time, and we need to really figure out how we can get to the podcasts. So if you had actual site addresses and
it's actually
phone
up on the screen.
Oh, it's on the screen right now.
Yep, that's the website is thesecretlifeofdeath.com. All the episodes are there, and it's fun to check in on that because I have pictures to go along with the stories. So if you want to see the gravestones or maps and things like that of what I'm talking about, and also just just notes about the show, little details that might not have fit into the narration, but make more sense when looking at a picture, something like that.
Great.
What a great way to tell history, though. I mean, what a way to make history real. I think because people think, you think of history and you're like, ugh, kind of dry, kind of whatever. But I got sucked into your website, and I didn't listen to a complete podcast yet, but 'cause I was just doing the research. But I think it's, it's fascinating. I think for people, even like for schools, for kids to learn local history and to learn about things, what a great way, because they could have a field trip, they could listen, lots of applications.
Yeah, exactly. All of these places are pretty local with a few exceptions. People could drive to them very easily in a few hours at most. And yeah, it's all outside, so it's perfect for stuff like for right now if you're worried about COVID and things like that. So it's or just right down the street if there's like, oh, there's a cemetery, I've never been there. Give people an idea of something to do.
Great.
Do people send you ideas? Has anyone?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had a few, and some of the best shows that I wasn't expecting have come out of them. So I love that.
Wonderful.
Nice.
Well, we want to thank you for coming on today. It was fascinating. I'm going to get out and listen to podcasts.
I know.
That's one of those generational things. I think it's my son is always saying, "You listen to this podcast," and I'm always like, "Oh, I'd rather do so," so I end up listening to music and not podcasts. And anyway, thank you, Gail.
Thanks, Gail.
And,
thank you guys so much.
Yes.
You're so welcome.
That's it for us this week on The Feed, and we'll see you next week when we have another guest coming
We have
up.
J.R. Lane next week.
Oh, right, J.R.
Talking
Lane.
about, it's actually Recovery Month, I believe.
Okay. So until then, we'll see you. This is Mike and Marty.
Bye.